Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. This is the first content lecture for Philosophy 3020, Early Modern Philosophy. Okay, there is going to be a different lecture that will get you oriented in the course. This lecture is on philosophical content. Okay, and specifically, we're going to talk about René Descartes and his book, Discourse on the Method for Reasoning Well and for Seeking Truth in the Sciences, which sounds ambitious, right? It was ambitious. He was trying to come up with the correct method, finally, right, after millennia, the correct method for really finding the truth, especially in the sciences, right? He's interested in helping to get the physical sciences of his day on a firm footing, okay? Now, this book that we're looking at was published in 1637. Descartes himself lived from 1596 to 1650. He was a Frenchman, if that matters, but he ended up settling in the Netherlands because there was a lot of intellectual freedom available there. He was afraid of getting in trouble with the Catholic Church because of his interests, especially because he was convinced that the sun is really at the center of the solar system. Right now it's built into the word solar system or the phrase solar system, but it wasn't then, right? He had what was considered a radical view. By the time he wrote the Discourse, Galileo had already been put under house arrest by the Catholic Church. He'd already been condemned for holding that same view. Okay, so Descartes a bit nervous about his own views and beliefs, and sometimes he's not as direct as he could be about what he really believes. In fact, I would say the Discourse on the Method and the Meditations on First Philosophy, which we'll cover more exhaustively, both of those books are fairly abstract. Now, the Discourse is followed by some essays. It was published together with some essays that aren't so abstract. Descartes actually applies the method, but, not to the solar system, to more local phenomena. So I think he's a little indirect and definitely abstract in the Discourse and the Meditations, and it is partly because he's nervous about the Catholic Church. Regarding his dates, right, so I said he lived from 1596 to 1650. I just want to point out that this puts him near the tail end of the Renaissance, I would say. I mean, it depends on when you think the Renaissance ends. But in the 1500s, let's say the Renaissance was still going on. In other words, the rebirth, the rediscovery of classical knowledge from the Greeks and the Romans, right? And so here Descartes is at the tail end of that. Knowledge is sort of being reborn and is trying to find a new way forward, and then Descartes helps to shape the new way forward, let's say. Okay, so we'll have a long background video on Descartes and what he was trying to do. I'll put that up later because it's really keyed to the Meditations more than to the Discourse. We'll just start by just going through this text and seeing what's in it. So we'll sort of start out easy, and then next week we'll get into all that deep background, and we'll start figuring out how the Meditations works. Okay, so how does the Discourse start out? It starts out with some points about good sense, which is sort of an open-ended term, deliberately so, right? Everybody thinks they have a good sense. We might even say common sense. That's not really the right translation for what he says. But what exactly is he talking about? Something like common sense. Anyway, everybody thinks they have plenty of that, is his main point. And not only do they think they have plenty of it, but they're right. Everybody has reasonably good judgment. That's a very optimistic view that Descartes has, but that is the view. When he's talking about good sense, he's talking about the ability to judge of things, whether that works, whether that's correct, whether that's well argued. Everybody's got reasonably good judgment. However, right off the bat, and this becomes more of a theme as we go along that gets further developed, obviously people disagree. There's a great diversity of opinions. So immediately there's a tension, right, in this view. So everybody's got good sense, everybody's got good judgment, and yet we have all these different opinions. They can't all be correct. They're not all compatible with each other. So how do we account for that discrepancy? Descartes says, well, people have good judgment, but they go along different routes. They go along different paths, right? Their minds don't look at the same things. They don't judge of the same things. They don't take the same evidence into account. So these good minds follow different paths, different routes. So that already suggests if we had one route, one path that we knew was best, then we could reduce diversity of opinion. We could get more clear on what's actually correct, right? So that's, ultimately what Descartes wants to offer us, a fixed route, a fixed path, something that works, something that can be argued for, that can be seen to be a good method. Interestingly, Descartes says he doesn't have a gifted intellect. Is it a false modesty? I don't know. I'm not sure. But he's pretty emphatic about it. I don't think he's being insincere, I guess, at the end of the day. It's compatible with what he says in other texts. So he doesn't think he's particularly gifted. He lists the traits that great minds have, right? They have quick thoughts. They have clear and distinct imaginations. They have ample and actively involved memories. Apparently, Descartes doesn't believe he has any of that stuff going for him, right? He has an okay intellect. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. He does say eventually that he's not inferior, right? When he looks around at others who are his peers, people that he went to school with. He went to a Jesuit school, the College of La Flèche. When he looks around at those people that he took classes with, he says, "Well, I'm not inferior. I'm not less than, but I'm not gifted, right?" And whether he's sincere or not, the point is this method that he wants to give us, this is what he's really saying, is not for gifted people, but for people who are okay, who have, amply endowed intellects, like sufficient intellects, sufficient intellectual firepower. It's for people like that who want to know the truth, right? If they're competent, let's say, intellectually, and they really want to know the truth, they really want to tell truth from falsity, this method is for them. right? So you don't need to have those special intellectual gifts to get the method to work. Descartes claims he's been fortunate. He's had the right experiences. The experiences he has had have helped him to see the correct path. Not everybody has had the same experiences, so not everybody can see the path as well as he can. He sees it clearly. He wants to show the way to other competent people, right? Okay, so I haven't been mentioning page numbers, but maybe I'll pause for a second and say, okay, this is our textbook, Early Modern Philosophy and Ontology, edited by Lisa Shapiro and Marcy P. Lascano. And this text starts on page 87, and everything I've said so far can be found on page 87, and now I'm about to make a point from page 88, which is why I thought, well, maybe I should mention page numbers. All right, since Descartes is not a towering intellectual figure, he claims, he can't really recommend his method on the basis of authority, right? Which is interesting, right? So we're at the tail end of the Renaissance. We're going into the Enlightenment. That's what we're going toward, which is sort of, among other things, a rejection of intellectual authority, right? Just throw it off. And Descartes' a good Catholic, as far as we can tell, but this is also a very Protestant idea that he's espousing. Right, we don't have to take things on authority. We can use our own good sense, right? I mean, ultimately, going beyond Descartes, we can use our own conscience. We can use our own rationality. Descartes would like that, of course. So he can't say as a sort of authority that you should adopt his method. What he can do is he can give you a sort of history. That's what he says. He uses the word history here. That tells you how he came to find his method valuable. Right, so that's what he ends up doing. This ends up being a somewhat autobiographical text. Okay, so I mentioned that he went to the flesh. He went to a Jesuit institution. He's right to say this is one of the greatest schools of his day. That's how we look back on it. It was a great university, a lot of bustling intellectual activity. Some important findings were made there, right? So Descartes is really in the thick of it intellectually by going to the flesh. So the thing is, he goes through what he calls the standard course of literature, right? There's a set of books that people are supposed to read, is what he's saying. And so he works his way through them. He makes his professors happy. He does what they want him to do. At the end of this process of education, when he's read these books and he's listened to his professors and he's gone to their lectures and he's heard what they have to say about these books that they're telling him to read, at the end of that, he's full of doubts, right? So that's a big problem. He went into this thinking, oh, wow, I'm really going to know about the world. I'm really going to have knowledge. It's going to be high quality knowledge. This is a good school. These are the best professors. I'm really going to know things at the end of this. And then actually, when he's done, he's full of doubts. He's not sure what's true. He's not sure what's false. It's at this point that he actually mentions, and by the way, I'm not inferior, right? He doesn't say he's superior. He already said, I'm not a towering intellectual authority. I'm not intellectually gifted, but I'm not inferior. Either I kept up with my peers, I was adequate, and yet I'm full of doubts. What does that tell us? Well, what that tells us is that this course of literature that's supposed to provide knowledge doesn't do it. He's saying, here I am, I'm the sort of person that is supposed to be educated by this system. There's nothing special about me. I'm neither gifted nor a dullard. I'm neither of those things. I'm sort of, as far as people who go to Jesuit universities go, I'm just normal. I'm just sort of average. I'm in the middle of the pack, right? And I finish this course of study and I'm full of doubts. So the course of study doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Look at me. I'm a sort of paradigmatic example here, since I'm in the middle of the road intellectually. Look at the effect this education had on me. It made me doubtful. So there must be something up with this supposed body of knowledge. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't instill what it's supposed to instill, right? Okay, fair enough. I mean, really, we'd want a larger sample to be sure, but you understand what he's saying. Um, he's not yet saying anything that's supposed to be a scientific finding. He's saying I was diligent and competent, and I'm still full of doubts. So that should worry us, and that that's fair as far as it goes. Going into page 89, if we want a little orientation still, Descartes makes this interesting point that reading the greats, which is what he's done, is kind of like traveling, right? And when you travel, you learn a lot. You learn about what other cultures are like. Maybe you learn some languages. You learn other customs, habits. But there's this interesting tension that he points out. If you do nothing but travel, you kind of forget about where you came from, or you don't keep growing in that knowledge. You don't really learn about your home. You don't have a good, sophisticated knowledge of where you came from if you just leave it behind and keep traveling and never go back, right? And if you stay at home and you never go see the world, then you don't have anything to compare home to. So you're not really critical enough of home, of where you came from. So there's some kind of happy middle ground, right, where you should travel enough to get some perspective on where you came from. But you shouldn't completely lose track of where you came from either, right? You shouldn't completely forget about it. Okay, so reading the greats can be compared to that, in the sense that reading is good, but you also have to live in the real world, right? So Descartes wants knowledge that can be applied, in other words. I mean, he's a budding scientist again. He's not just a philosopher. Oh, those silly philosophers living in their abstractions. Like me, for instance. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, he does say some, critical things about philosophy. That's fine. We can all say critical things about philosophy. In any case, he wants something a little more applied than that. He's definitely doing philosophy. He knows that he is some of the time, and he does admit that he needs philosophy. But mainly he's trying to help the sciences get going, as I've already said. The physical sciences, especially, the ones that seem like they can use math, especially, right? Part of what Galileo showed, this isn't so much what he got in trouble for, but, Galileo showed that mathematics can be applied to natural phenomena in a very fruitful way, in a way that can help us predict precisely what's going to happen next. And Descartes is very impressed by that. So he wants to lay a groundwork for the natural sciences, the physical sciences, and part of that groundwork will be mathematical. He does want to put forward mathematics and geometry as paradigmatic, in other words, as really good models of knowledge and of how we gain knowledge. Speaking of critical points about philosophy, going into page 90, Descartes tells us what he thinks of philosophy, right? He's been through the great books, as we've mentioned, and now he's starting to think forward here, textually speaking. We're getting into some attempt to be constructive. How do we move forward? Well, okay, you look at philosophy. Can you do anything with philosophy or not? Well, there's too much disagreement in philosophy, right? Which by the way, already came up as a problem. If there's a lot of disagreement among experts, that means we don't know what's true, okay? And then that specific point applies to philosophy as well. So if you read the philosophers, you'll find that they disagree on a lot of things, and then that puts all of their principles and opinions under a cloud of suspicion, right? We have to be careful not to accept any of these things at face value, since they undermine and contradict each other, and so that leaves us not knowing for sure what's true. Now, Descartes admits that the sciences need some philosophical grounding, some philosophical principles, right? To be really brief here, and to oversimplify, right? The science tells us about the physical world, and in doing so, it assumes there's a physical world and assumes there are some proper ways to observe that world and get knowledge about it, right? And so what's the philosophical grounding of that? How do we know there's an external world, and how do we know our senses are telling us something about it, right? So that's long been the connection between philosophy and science. The tables are a little turned now, right? It used to be that philosophy had this reputation as a really important discipline, and the sciences were, of lesser importance. It was more practical stuff. You can use your scientific knowledge to do things, but philosophy is where the real wisdom is. And now that's a little turned on its head, in the sense that, here in the 21st century in the US, we tend to put science up here and think, oh, wow, science really gets things done. But scientists generally acknowledge that, well, there are these problems of knowledge and how we can know the world, so there is some philosophical grounding to our discipline. So, the beliefs are kind of the same. They haven't changed. Science needs some amount of philosophical clarification, but our values have changed. We're very impressed with science. We're not so impressed with philosophy. And that's kind of where Descartes is. He's getting that he's developing that modern outlook. Philosophy has its uses, but there's too much disagreement. We're going to take what we need from philosophy and not get too bogged down in philosophical discussion. That's what he suggests anyway, but then if you read the Meditations, I think he does get a little bogged down sometimes. All right, so if the sciences depend on philosophy, then the problems in philosophy tend to infect these other areas that rely on philosophy. So Descartes wants to figure out what to do about that. Right now, historically speaking, remember this is a history. He says, I worried about philosophy, and what did I decide to do about it? Well, I decided to travel, actually. That's what he says. He decided to sort of put off intellectual problems until he was a bit older, right? So he's thinking about when he finished his course of study. He graduated college. What did he do after that? He traveled, he says, I sought the kind of knowledge that could be quickly disconfirmed, which is a nice scientific way to think about it, right? He has a sort of vision of the world and how the world works and how to get along in the world, very practical knowledge. So then if he travels and he tries to use that knowledge, then the parts that don't work, that aren't translatable, that don't travel very well across national boundaries, those parts will be quickly disconfirmed because he's traveling, because he's trying to use this knowledge to get things done in the world. That's again, a very scientific way to look at it. So he also says one of his main takeaways from this period of his life, when he sort of put aside intellectual study and tried to pursue a different kind of knowledge, something he learned from this time of life is to be very, very skeptical of knowledge that's based on custom, which, if you really think about it, is a bit of a jab at, letting the church dictate what we should believe in the realm of science, right? He can't directly say something like, well, the Catholic Church shouldn't have condemned Galileo. Galileo was a great mind who was seeking the truth through this new, very fruitful method. He can't say that. He doesn't want to end up being arrested. What he can say is be skeptical of knowledge that's based on custom or habit. Have an open mind. Really look at the phenomena. Really look at the world with fresh eyes as much as possible. Right? So there's this enlightenment current here. It's a bit subterranean. He's not fully speaking his mind, I think, but it's there. Okay, well, all of that is part one of the discourse. In other words, chapter one. We could just call it chapter one. And now we go into chapter two, or part two. And we're going to get even more constructive now. So Descartes points out that cities, certainly from his point of view, cities are better when designed by one person. They're not usually, of course. Usually cities might start out being designed by one person, but then they just grow over time. They develop through accretion, through addition, and things maybe get a bit messy. But if one person takes charge and designs a small city, it's well ordered. It's consistent, right? Because it's got a single vision behind it, right? So then it's better in the sense that it's more orderly. It makes more sense. Descartes says the same thing about constitutions. Sometimes constitutions grow through accretion in the same way. Not all constitutions are written constitutions, so especially when a constitution isn't written down, it can just sort of develop organically over time. But then it gets messy, and maybe it's unclear what the Constitution says about this or that particular thing. But when it's written down, it's the result of one clear vision, and so it's orderly, it's consistent. We know what it's saying. Okay, so why is Descartes telling us this? Well, he's making an analogy. So cities are better when designed by one person. Constitutions are better when designed by a single person. Wouldn't our thinking be better if it were led by a single vision? And specifically, wouldn't our judgment be better if we had been rational from the beginning? But we were not, right? When we're babies and little children, we just absorb, right? We absorb the knowledge around us, which may or may not actually be knowledge, and we repeat it back, and we get socially rewarded for that. And that can be messy, right? So extending the analogy some more, social knowledge is messy, has grown through accretion, is not the result of a single vision. So it's not orderly, and it's not always clear what social knowledge, what our knowledge is telling us, right? It's got some gray areas, it's got some gaps. So since people sometimes decide this house is a mess, I can't fix it, I'm going to demolish it and build something new, doesn't that indicate, this is where Descartes' really been headed, doesn't that indicate that it could be beneficial to just destroy one's knowledge, right? In other words, try to clear out one's opinions, try to become free of opinions. just clear them all out, and then start over, right? So he's imagining sort of creating a blank slate. Like some people think we're born with a blank slate. That's the term they use. That's not actually Descartes' view, but we don't need to get into that right now. But this is something like being born again, right? If you think about it. So maybe you were born with something like a blank slate. Can you get back to that point of being a blank slate? Well, Descartes thinks maybe you could sort of demolish your opinions, you could be critical of them, you could sort of clear them away, and you could build something new. And okay, so that's basically the method then. But the method is personal. And Descartes' emphatic about that, and it's probably partly because he's trying to stay out of trouble. This is a method for Descartes to follow. And some of his readers. He actually mentions a couple of categories of people who shouldn't follow the method. He mentions impatient people, which I always think is amusing. You need patience, right? If you're impatient, you won't get past the destructive part of the method. If you're impatient, then once you've cleared away the old opinions, you're not going to be able to replace them with something better, right? Because that takes a lot of work. Okay, so anyway, the method is personal. We're not going to destroy all of social knowledge. We're not going to destroy our collective knowledge. Descartes knows that could be dangerous, right? Sometimes institutions are good because they're there and they exist and we can rely on them, and they're not ideal, but if you destroy them, there will be chaos, and it's not clear how long it will take to build new institutions, right? I mean, to some extent, that's where we are politically in the U.S., right? I think you can see that whether you're on the right or on the left. There's a lot of distrust in institutions and political parties. And we're kind of at this point where we're thinking, is it worth going through the demolition of the parties that exist and, just starting from scratch? Is that a worthwhile thing? It's dangerous, right? It creates instability. And so Descartes is actually touching on some of this stuff that's affecting us right now. I mean, he knows plenty about political instability, right? He participated in the 30 Years' War on both sides for some reason. He fought with the Protestants and he fought with the Catholics. Some people think that shows he was a spy at some point in there. We don't need to get into all that, although it's interesting. My main point here is Descartes' method is personal. He's not trying to be overly critical of collective knowledge and sort of just bring down the whole university system or something like that. Far be it from him, he's not even a gifted intellectual to do something like that. This is just a personal method. And again, I would say, well, maybe he would like to bring down some parts of collective knowledge, but he's also hedging his bets and doesn't want to upset the Catholic Church too much. Okay, so speaking of chaos and instability, Descartes mentions that he was careful to have his plan in place for rebuilding knowledge before he got rid of it all. Okay, and so finally we've got to ask, well, goodness, what's the constructive part? How are you going to build it back up? What did you have in place before you destroyed your old opinions? Well, he's already said nice things about mathematics, and so he continues in that vein. He speaks highly of logical analysis. Really, he's thinking of Aristotle, because even in Descartes' time, Aristotle is considered the expert on logic. So Aristotle initiated a sort of system of categorical syllogisms, right? Argument forms that were widely used. They became part of the university curriculum in the Middle Ages. So just as an example, just to try to tell you more concretely what I mean. So you remember Dante, he wrote the Divine Comedy, right? The Inferno, the Purgatorio, the Paradiso. Remember that guy? You've probably read some Dante. So he also wrote a book called On Monarchy, where it's what it sounds like. He tries to argue that monarchy is the best system of government. Think what you will of that. My point is, the whole book is written as a series of syllogisms, right? Which again, it's just a way of formulating the argument. We don't want to get into that in a lot of detail. But these are forms that Aristotle developed in his logical works. And anyway, Descartes, when he's thinking about how we can be constructive, he speaks highly of logical analysis, he speaks highly of algebra, he speaks highly of geometry. what do these things have in common? What do these disciplines have in common? Um, well, they're very clear, and they can get certain results. Um, like a syllogism, for instance, if I can think of one. Well, there is a sort of famous syllogism, so I guess I don't have to think of it on the fly. All men are mortal. Socrates is immortal. Sorry. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay. So the point of giving you that sort of standard syllogism is to say, well, look, if it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then it has to be true that Socrates is mortal. Therefore, in the realm of syllogisms, in the realm of logical analysis, there is certainty, right? Now, Socrates is mortal isn't any more certain than all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. You don't gain certainty, but you don't lose any. If you're completely certain that all men are mortal and you're completely certain that Socrates is a man, then you are completely certain that Socrates is mortal, that Socrates will die, which he did, right? So I'm going to the trouble of giving you a syllogism because, okay, well, you already took algebra and geometry in high school and maybe in middle school a bit before that as well. So you know what those involve. You know there are these fixed rules that you can use to go from one certain thing to another certain thing. So algebra, geometry, and logical analysis have that in common. However, Descartes doesn't accept them as full disciplines. He says they're good models. As disciplines, there's plenty of obscurity. There's plenty of obscurity in algebra. There's plenty we don't know. Algebra is not fully rational from one end to the other. Logical analysis has its gaps. Does Aristotle give us a full accounting of how logic works? Well, Descartes doesn't have a good criticism of that, but in fact, Aristotle definitely did not give us a full accounting of how logic works. He built a system of a certain kind of logic that was a bit of a closed system, and it works for some things and not others. And basically, algebra and geometry are the same, and Descartes had some intuition of that, even if he didn't have the criticisms ready to go. Here's how these are incomplete disciplines. But he seems to recognize that as disciplines, let's say there's some obscurity, but these are good models. What they do is they give us some definite rules so that if we start with some clear, clean elements or concepts, we can transition to other clean and clear elements or concepts. I mean, that's basically what these things have in common. Okay, so Descartes takes these three disciplines, areas as models, and he puts forward his own method. His own method consists of 4 rules, and he thinks this is great, right? A small set of rules, when the rules are good, when the rules are sound, is a really great thing, right? In other words, if it's only four rules, you could really hold the rules in your head and you could always follow them and be consistent. And sure, there must be some other good rules out there, but there's something to be said for a small set of rules that you can really hold in your mind, right? And you could always make sure that you're following them because they're contained enough that you can really remember them and focus on them. Anyway, here are the rules, right? Starting on page 93, going into page 94. First rule, accept clear and distinct presentations and nothing else. Accept what you perceive clearly and distinctly. If you have a clear and distinct grasp, meaning nothing is hidden here, and you can tell these elements apart from other elements that don't belong in your formula or in your phenomenon that you happen to be looking at. You know what you've got in itself and in comparison to other things. Clear and distinct. That's what clear and distinct amounts to. So what is clearly and distinctly presented to you, you can take for granted. That's your starting point. Get rid of everything else. Other things may be true. Things that aren't clearly and distinctly presented to you may be true. You cannot use those things as starting points. That's the first rule. Second rule, analysis. Divide into parts as needed, right? So there's some problem we're trying to solve. There's something we're trying to get clear on. There's something we're trying to know for certain. Well, things are complex, and you've got to break them down. There's an art here. I mean, he can't tell you, here's how much you need to analyze something, right? So there's art involved in this method. Keep analyzing until you have enough clarity, right, to proceed, right? I mean, the rules need each other, right? The second rule says analyze until things are resolved enough for you to move forward, but how much do you have to analyze exactly? Well, go back to the first rule. Did you analyze until your elements were clear and distinct? That's what you need to do, right? Third rule, conduct my thoughts in an orderly way. There's not always a right order, it's important to say. Sometimes there is. Sometimes there's a best way to proceed. You know, if we're talking about a causal issue, what causes what, then the temporal sequence is important. Which happened first and which happened second. We usually think the cause was first, the effect was later. Sure, could be exceptions in there somewhere. The point is, sometimes we have a clear order. We know what the order should be. Even when we don't, this is part of what the third rule is saying, have an order. You know, have a set order. Don't be random. Don't be haphazard. Don't be arbitrary. Rather say, this is the order. This is how we're proceeding. And partly what you're doing is you're disciplining your mind, right? If you just allow yourself to be capricious or arbitrary or whatever, you're giving yourself too much flexibility, right? I mean, we all have this problem of, here's what we want to believe, so we're going to fidget with the evidence until we think we have an argument for what we wanted to believe anyway. So part of what he's getting at is, well, things need to be fixed. Things need to be set. You can't give yourself a lot of leeway. That's not wholly what he's focused on here. But that is partly it, yeah. But I guess the main thing is just there needs to be consistency and coherence, and so we must impose order. We must have an order, even if we're not sure which order is the right one. Maybe that will become clear when we pan out again, right? When we get really focused and try to solve a micro problem, maybe we don't know what the right order is. We'll have to impose one just to get through, to muddle through and get to a solution. Maybe when we pan out again, then we'll see that that was the right order to follow, or maybe we'll see that, in context, maybe a different order would have been better. But if we have a set way of starting out and proceeding, then we can make that determination later when it becomes more salient. I think that's fine. That makes sense. Finally, the fourth rule. I will make my calculations so complete and my reviews so general that nothing will be omitted. That's an interesting combination of things. So the calculations will be complete, so there will be thorough coverage, right? That's certainly in line with not omitting anything. But he also says reviews so general. So there's a deliberate embrace of abstraction here, which you might rightly worry about. Right? We're always going to come back to these general terms, right? And make sure we have sort of a good general pattern that's coherent and clear. You might worry that that could end up falsifying something, right? But it does do what Descartes says. It'll help you not omit anything. It's just that you might be trying to fit really complex phenomena into a general pattern that can't really capture everything. It's what you'd expect a rationalist to say, by the way. We'll get into that more later. Descartes' not an empiricist, he's a rationalist. So he's assuming, he's not going to tell you that, he's assuming that, of course, we've got some clear and distinct concepts somewhere that will capture everything that needs to be captured, or we can develop them. It's not a problem, right? In other words, our rational nature and structure and the contents of our rational mind are adequate to this task that we're doing. I think that's sort of built into the fourth rule, but you think about it as well and see whether you agree. So anyway, those are the rules. Clear and distinct presentations, divide, be orderly, do thorough calculations, and a general review that covers everything. Yeah, that does sound like it's very much in line with Aristotelian logic and algebra and geometry, and those are Descartes' paradigms. Those are his models of knowledge, which again shows he's a rationalist, right? Because these are very tightly, rationally structured disciplines, and what we wonder about is how well they apply to the world, right? So we're not being empiricists here. We're not starting with the world. We're taking as our models of knowledge really well conceptually structured disciplines, right? Things that have been worked out in the mind, and we're really not sure the extent to which they what does algebra really apply to? That you can raise that question. It's a great discipline, can tell you really important things, but what are the limits of application? What can you rightly apply algebra to, and what can't you? It's not entirely clear, right? So we see the rationalism here. Okay, I think that covers the discourse in a helpful way, but you may have your own opinion. In any case, I've said what I wanted to say, and I hope that it's been helpful. Thank you very much.